Welcome. Thank you for setting aside the time today. And if you're watching this as a recording, thank you also, as you won't be able to ask questions. And I very much appreciate your time here. If you do want further information, please contact me at the email address on this slide. Before I get into things, I would like to thank Catherine Mills for the opportunity to speak today, Molly Johnston for her support in getting us together and giving me excellent advice, including IT advice, I might add, my other colleagues who I rely on frequently and have been great supporters of this work. I acknowledge that quite incredibly, today is the International Day of the Midwife, and while some of this content may be challenging, I know that midwives are an important part of the multidisciplinary team that care for women, and they play a key role with others in seeking to make birth better for women. Also incredibly, yesterday was World Maternal Mental Health Day. So in a bit of serendipity, it seems that this little talk is of its time. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the fact that Monash sits on the land of the traditional custodians, who are the Kulin Nation, and I work and live on this land, and these lands were never ceded, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So this slide just sets out the presentation structure. I'll present the background to the ideas about what, as I see it, creates the perfect conditions for dissonance in women, both during and after birth. This focuses on how women are prepared for birth, including conversations that they might have with healthcare professionals, classes that women tend to attend, often presented by midwives, physiotherapists and other allied health professionals, sometimes with an obstetrician who might attend one or two. I haven't heard of any with an anaesthetist being present. Women also rely on media, apps, books and discussions with other people who have birthed. I will then talk about what I did in the study in order to answer the research questions that I developed, and I will summarise what the data say. And for a bit of extra interest, I will finish with a little autoethnography and some conclusions, so that I'm hoping it will lead into an interesting discussion. So to begin, the key grounding premise from which I begin here is that labour pain is a different pain to other types of acute pain. It is a pain that is of the body, it is finite, it is not diagnostic, and it usually results in the birth of a baby. Other types of acute pain are usually associated with trauma or a planned surgical intervention to alleviate a condition or pathology. Pain in labour has a complex history. Women are prepared in a certain way in countries like Australia, Canada, the UK and New Zealand. The US is different, and I will generally not be referring to it when I talk about healthcare systems in this talk for reasons of insurance, massive inequities, and basically a complex system that fails to provide care to a whole portion of women. Women who are having their first baby and are low risk in Australia, UK, and those other places I've mentioned will attend antenatal classes often. They're encouraged to, they're not compulsory. They'll read books, gather information from forums or friends, and much of what that will be focused on is how a woman can and should birth. And this is summarised above. This preparation, I will argue, is not in line with the facts associated with the use of pain relief in first births, in particular, as shown in the AIHW data regarding the use of pain relief. For those women that aim to deliver their baby without the use of drugs, as per this data, 2/3 of them are leaving the event not having done that. The question becomes, why are we telling women to do birth a certain way when we know the majority won't? I will argue throughout this presentation that the tension that runs between midwifery and obstetrics has led to each profession seeking to differentiate themselves at times from the other. As such, because obstetrics is argued to be technical, medical and bureaucratic, as Davis Floyd coined famously, technocratic, midwifery has sought to do something different. The messaging in midwifery texts is that women are powerful and have the resources within them to generally birth without medical intervention. This is often true, but not always. Obstetrics has had a gruesome history, which I do not wish to minimise, and a medicine of a misogynistic past, but the benefits of anaesthetic surgery and medication cannot be cast aside when women today have access to greater amounts of information and are encouraged to be informed consumers for their healthcare journey over the life course. This means that midwifery and obstetrics can come at the pain in labour problem from slightly different angles. Obstetrics will often see it as a clinical problem that is impacting on labouring women and that can be relieved via pharmacological means. Midwifery appears to frame pain in labour as purposeful and the use of pain relief as an impediment to the natural cascade of hormones that spur labour along, providing the birthing woman with endogenous relief and helps women avoid epidurals that they don't need and they often argue don't want. For them, the pain in labour has the opportunity to transform. For medicine, pain in labour is a byproduct of labour caused by a contracting uterus, amongst other things. Little mention is ever made in midwifery journals about the stress and stress hormones that pain responses create, and that women value having a say in their pain management, and that pain in and of itself can be traumatising, even if the outcome is as desired, i.e. vaginal birth with no epidural, a live mother and live baby. I suggest, however, that something is going dreadfully wrong when women can birth as hoped with a good outcome per the data, but still leave feeling broken. The recently released Ockenden report is some evidence of what happens when the pursuit of a particular type of birth is privileged over and above other things. 201 babies died and 9 women over a near 20-year time frame. I'll just touch on that report briefly. So it might not be ideal, but surgical deliveries do save lives if that intervention is provided at the right time. In the Ockenden report, it was found that there was sometimes a desire to pursue vaginal births or physiological births, but the terms are contested, and I note that. I don't have time to discuss nomenclature here. Over surgical birth, when the latter would have been preferable, to use synthetic oxytocin to augment labour and to attempt vaginal deliveries in instances when a caesarean section would have been attempted in most other settings. Time does not permit a thorough analysis of the report, but I do wish to use the Ockenden report as a backgrounding tool to frame why birth is not necessarily always able to be done how we had hoped, particularly if we wish to have low fetal and maternal mortality rates, and also why women are good people to listen to in the birthing equation. Unlike the UK, Australia has a different model here where it is generally an on-site multidisciplinary team approach, and there is a far more active and larger, I would add, private sector of obstetric care. Intrapartum care, so when a woman is birthing, is generally midwife-led in both the public and private sectors, and midwives act as gatekeepers to all other services. However, generally those services are readily available on site unless it's a standalone birthing unit, of which there are very few. High-risk women will usually be birthing at a hospital, and very high-risk women, so let's say concurrent cancer, hard to control diabetes, type 1 or 2, will likely be overseen by an obstetric team with paediatricians, midwives and other healthcare professionals at tertiary hospitals with ICUs and neonatal ICUs nearby. As I have noted, sorry, I just lost my spot here, the terms physiological birth, sorry, I've just, my little arrow's gone. Not good. Oops, sorry. Whoops. Okay. I might just proceed. I've lost my arrow completely. Oh, there it is. Found it. Sorry about that. So as I have noted, the use of the terms physiological birth, normal birth, and natural birth are confusingly interchanged. I've talked about how I don't have time for this, but to discuss in detail what these mean, because they are quite contested and whole books have been written on them. But normal birth is generally considered to be a vaginal birth. Natural birth is definitely a vaginal birth and one with minimal intervention. Physiological birth is pretty much, as I've been able to discern, a substitute term for normal birth. And these terms exclude birth via caesarean section, as this is a surgical birth. Most women having their first baby will hope for a normal birth, and many will hope to achieve a natural birth. And I'll explain why this happens later. But it appears to be because women absorb messaging that birth without pain, relieving drugs, is best for them and their babies. In spite of this, women having their first baby go on to have pharmacological pain relief, and this is because birth hurts. So I ask you to take note of the concepts that are in this slide here and carry them with you throughout the presentation. What follows challenges broadly held views amongst some healthcare groups and indeed subgroups of larger populations that subscribe to the theory that women will be happy if they birth their baby as normally as possible and with as little intervention as possible. Birth is a culturally complex performance, and we all bring our own expectations and understanding of the idea of birth to birth. We don't all think the same. Women are different, both across births and across individuals and across groups. Birth is transformative, but this can be a positive and a negative. It can lead to feelings of elation, joy, and triumph. It can also lead to feelings of despair and shock. sadness and overwhelming failure. Both of these ends of the emotional dichotomy are valid. Please keep this in mind as we progress. So this was my empirical study, and it is with some confidence that I can say that I think birth hurts, and these hurts are not just physical. There is a component of moral injury or cognitive discomfort that arises, which I will detail how and what this means later. But in a study that I've outlined here, I conducted a semi-longitudinal ethnographic study. It was an Australian-based hospital. I only was in one unit, and I will note that birthing units and centres and hospitals have their own culture, so I acknowledge that. I interviewed 12 health professionals, along with 13 women who I interviewed 3 times, 36 weeks gestation, soon after delivery, and then 6 months later, and then 2 women I interviewed twice. Anaesthetists were on call at these facilities at all times, and all women selected into the study were low risk. This presentation therefore relates to the findings from the birthing women involved in this study. The health professionals sadly will have to wait for another day. From this study, I have summarised it into 3 themes for the ease of understanding, and these themes are how women are prepared for birth, asking for pain relief in labour and responses to that request, and trauma emerging post-birth when labour did not match their expectations. So let's begin with theme 1. I tried to work out, and that's where I started, if perhaps women were not being well prepared for labour. I wanted to know if this was the problem. Why are women leaving birth shocked, as the data tell us they are, which I will detail? It's the age of the internet, can't they find out everything that they need to know? I would argue that part of post-birth trauma that women feel is contributed to by how women are prepared for labour. So how are women prepared for labour? I asked myself this question and went about finding out. I asked women in this study, my study, in an effort to collect evidence from them. I thought this was important because this was how their expectations were given foundation. I found that they prepared using a variety of methods: classes, forums, internet, books, other social media, and apps. So many apps, let me show you. So here's a screenshot. I just Googled in, 10 of the 20 best information apps, you can have. Then books also got a mention. This one got talked about by my sample. The cover tells us this is for women who are thinking and that they can seek alternatives to high-tech birth because it assumed that people would be looking for alternatives to technology and birth. I just think this is an interesting assumption to make. There are messages that women absorb about what sort of birth they should aim for. And this is one of my favourite book covers of all time, when you're saying something with a picture that doesn't match the words. And that picture makes me scared, and maybe that's just me. I've had 2 babies, that's why it scares me. I remember there will be other women here who will too. I find this idea that if women could just be a bit braver, their births would hurt less, a little trivialising and patronising. This is a theory devised by Grantley Dick Reed, who has a bit of a sidebar issue, visited rural settings in what he regarded as primitive countries and considered what they went about birth in a fuss-free manner. Birth was a lived experience, it was part of life, it was almost just the rhythm, it was ordinary. If women in his mind could fear birth less, it would hurt them less, in the same way he considered primitive women did not appear to birth in great amounts of pain. And my little arrow thing's gone again. I'm not sure why this is happening, but it is. Sorry, bear with me. It will reappear, I'm sure. I found it. Yes. I actually reject this reading of birth as trouble-free. If one can empty their mind and think of the idea of the unfettered with birth, is silent on the fact that women without midwifery or obstetric care can be wounded for life with fistulas and other socially damning injuries. And the Catherine Hamlin Fistula Hospital in Ethiopia is testament to the outcomes of obstructed labours in women. Okay. And if women could be less stressed, here's another book we get to look at, Hypnobirthing. They'd be able to train their minds to think about birth differently, and that would be better too. I would like to refer here to the excellent work of Paula Michaels on Lamaze and other psychoprophylactic techniques that have variable results for women. Michaels astutely points out in her forensic history of Lamaze that I recommend to you that much of the drive to encourage women to embrace psychoprophylaxis was generated out of the shortage of opiates imposed by the Second World War and the disruption to international supply chains. As such, women were prepared for birth in the absence of the availability of opiates, the convenient marriage of psychology to address a pharmacology shortage. Books that healthcare professionals refer to include paragraphs such as this. I'll leave you a minute to read that. As I read it, this tells women that if they have an epidural in labour, they are not strong, that they are not willing to fight for the well-being of their children, and that they have missed out on an experience that can be transformative. I find this statement troubling and also lacking evidence. I'm not aware of any studies having been done that have looked at the quality of parenting of women over time that have had an epidural versus those that have not. The fact that this is in a textbook and says to me what I think it says means it will say it to other women. I think this needs serious re-examination in terms of messaging and the assertion it makes in light of a paucity of evidence. It is in this milieu that women having their first baby are preparing for birth, and if this is in textbooks, then it speaks to the general tenor of what healthcare professionals, and this was a midwifery textbook, are being taught about the formative effects of pain relief. So theme 2, I looked at how women have prepared. Now I'm going to look at what happened to women when they asked for pain relief. So having been prepared a certain way, what happens when in labour, in spite of hoping for a drug-free, low intervention birth, and they ask for pain relief? How is that responded to? What happens? Does anything happen? And I'll remind you, I selected in women that were hoping to have a very low intervention, not use any drugs, vaginal birth. So I wanted to compare how they felt post-birth about their pre-birth expectations. And one of the things I specifically wanted to do that I saw as a gap in the literature was to ask what happened when they made a request for pain relief. I note with some surprise, as it was to me, that of the 15 women in my study, one woman had the birth she planned and all others had to engage additional technology or pain relief or both. I note this is not a quantitative study and I am a qualitative researcher, but I was surprised by that ratio. So this is, I think infographic is a bit generous. I'll go with diagram that tells us who asked for pain relief. So I had 15 women in the study, 14 asked directly for pain relief. Remember, all these women were hoping for a normal, natural, vaginal, physiological birth. We've talked about in the nomenclature, I won't go back there. They all wish to avoid pain relief, some assiduously and some less so. So what happened here, and you can see that they break into 2 groups. This slide tells us that they all needed some form of pain relief. Some were happier with more aggressive means in terms of using it than others, but I had selected in women who wanted a vaginal birth with little intervention. 12 women, this group up here at the top, in the top box, had to ask directly for pain relief once or more and had their pain relief requests met eventually. For some women, one request was not adequate. For some, it was. For those women who had their request met eventually and went on to have a complex delivery, 3 had developed what I have classified as birth dissonance, which I'll explain later, and 3 did not. All those who had their pain relief request met and a straightforward delivery did not report any issues. While a larger study would be useful, perhaps what is instructive here is a comparison between this group and the group down the bottom here that never had their pain relief request met. Of these 2 women, both went on to develop birth dissonance, even though one had a straightforward delivery. This diagram does not include one participant who I've talked about who did not ask for pain relief, but she was of the view that they should have known she was in pain. She did go on to develop birth dissonance, and quite badly, in fact. She required therapy for some months post seeing a therapist/counsellor. And at last contact that I had with her, she had not had further children, and that was some 4 years post the delivery of her baby for this study. So in short, it appeared to me that if women ask for pain relief and have their request deferred, it possibly increases their risk of developing a form of dissonance associated because of unmet expectations. Having a complex delivery also appears to increase the risk of women developing birth dissonance. No woman, firstly, did not ask for pain relief, and 2, then have a straightforward delivery. So I cannot make any assessment of what that might mean. That did not happen in this study. The one woman who did not ask for pain relief had a forceps delivery with a late pudendal block, which was limited in effect. I think it is interesting that for 15 women hoping to birth vaginally with minimal pain relief, all have either had to ask for pain relief or had a complex delivery or both. In short, none of the 15 got the wholly drug-free, low intervention birth that they were hoping for. And this was, as I would point out, in a midwifery-led environment. This was not in a obstetrically led unit that is right adjacent to a tertiary hospital. This was in a birthing unit that had obstetricians and anaesthetists come and visit it from the tertiary hospital with which it was co-located. So what did happen when they did ask for pain relief, given that that's looked like how they turned out? I wish to go back to this point because this was, after all, the main focus of my study. Women reported making clear demands for pain relief and in one case screaming for an epidural. The birthing woman's notes checked and with ethics permission provide a more subdued reading of events. This is a quick summary of her. She was given sterile water, but I do note that for the other women, time was often used to delay, and they were told that they were either too early or too late to have an epidural. This made me want to go and find out what was happening to these women, and so this is the woman's notes I looked at. First, I'll just let you read what she said. So that says a number of things clinically to me, but the important thing is that she's asked for an epidural. She feels that she's been discouraged from getting one. And in her head, she goes, no, I really want the epidural, but she's being told that you're doing well with your breathing. And then a period of time passes, which you'll see in the next slide. And she then says she's screaming for one. And that's when they tell her that she's too far dilated. And so the notes look like this. She's asked for an epidural at 6:30. And then syntocinin is introduced, which we know to be an augmenting agent of labour, which can also increase pain. She expresses a desire to push, which means she's advanced, but she's only at 10 centimetres, which means she's not quite dilated. I think she did have a posterior presentation. She's reviewed twice. She's uncomfortable. And then at 11:30, she delivers. And that's 5 hours between when she's asked for an epidural and when she actually delivered. And she was never given an epidural. She was given sterile water injections, which the evidence for those is equivocal. Some people are of the view that there is good evidence and other people are of the view that there is no evidence. Even while I was undertaking this study, the site at which I was doing it withdrew permission for midwives to use sterile water injections in people's backs. And so I will just leave that where it is because I think there's further work to be done on that. And so essentially, I would argue that her first request was not met, and then she was given what some people would argue is a placebo, and then she's proceeded to labour for another 5 hours in, I would argue, significant pain, and then delivered a baby at 11:30, and sadly for her, gone on to have a postpartum hemorrhage, which then needed further assistance. So in addition to the situation I've just mentioned where a labouring woman is asked for pain relief and that's substituted with what is essentially a placebo, as some studies refer to them, or she is deferred, I also found that according to some women in my study, some midwives commence the care relationship by advising that they won't be offered pain relief by the midwife, and by default it appears they won't be asked about her pain. Rather, the woman in labour has to ask for pain relief. I think there is some ethical contemplation to be done here. The birthing woman is the most vulnerable woman in the room. She has the least power and often the least agency. I think the capacity of a woman to know that she has to ask inverts the relationship in an unhelpful way, where the labouring woman must petition her healthcare professionals, and in this case it was midwives, for help. Setting the ground rules from the outset suggests that it is something that they know needs to be negotiated. I am not sure that this is the way to go about it. So in summary, my study completed in 2018 and the PhD was conferred in 2019, which my husband and I were both relieved about, found that women are actually not terribly well prepared for labour compared with the actual labour experience. Some data is important here because I think it impacts on how women prepare and then their expectations about how they emerge. So Australia has very low rates of maternal and infant mortality. We have 5 women per 100,000 aged 15 to 49, where in 2018 died, and infant mortality at 3.1 babies per 1,000 live births. That's in 2016. These rates are pretty impressive internationally. Most women, basically, that means can expect to exit a labour alive. And secondly, we would hope, but not always, we know this happens, with a life in their arms. Unfortunately, neonatal death does occur. In Australia, it's usually a good outcome. But what is not so good is that women can be traumatised in significant ways because of the things that they were told pre-birth, not what actually often happens in birth. I will now detail these findings set out in this slide here and provide evidence for my claims as I make them. And so this is what women told me, that it hurt more than they expected. I found that they might not be offered pain relief, they'll have to ask for it, and they may need an assisted delivery. So as I read about birth and how women prepare for birth, I realise birth has a meaning. It is not just a baby being born. So the different discourses around birth, the natural, the medical, the midwifery discourse, the popular media discourse, they all sort of compete. So let me state that while obviously birth is a physical activity, it also has a rendering effect. This is because birth means something. I do not think this means that women have to feel pain to become decent mothers. Rather, birth makes women into mothers because that's what we have agreed in social terms. The process of birth, however, because of the meaning given to it over and above the transactional one, makes women think about what sort of mothers that they might be based on how they birthed. This is because they are told that birth and mothering are related activities, and these are conflated without, in my opinion, good evidence. The ability of the woman to birth without pain relief is taken to presage what type of mother she will be. So why birth dissonance? Well, finally, my lifelong obsession with education came in handy. I turned to psychology, and as Catherine said, that was the first degree I completed to understand what I felt was going on. Coupled with my understanding of pain, which I'd acquired by working in coronary care and ICU, which I note is a very different environment to labour suites, and the different types of pain and the ability to relieve pain using modern anaesthetics and technology, I developed a theory of birth trauma arising from what I understood basically to be dissonance. And here I explain the how of that. So it is in giving women an expectation that is not necessarily aligned with the actual data, then women proceed on to birth and wonder at the end, how come it did not go like the book said it should? And I would argue that birth trauma post-delivery is not a new idea. The idea that birth trauma and pain might be causing dissonance is, but birth trauma studies have been completed for a long time, or not for a long time, for periods of time prior to now. So I looked at the studies, and this was included obviously in the thesis as part of the literature review. And I found this very helpful because it made me realise that many people had looked at birth trauma relating to birth, but they'd all used different things. So there was the IES, which is the impact event scale, the TES and the PSS. Its group sizes varied from 20, which would all be a qualitative study, to 1,640 people, which would be a quantitative study. Some measured trauma, which was a vague term. Others measured PTSD under a tool. And this was all done at varying timeframes, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and 6 months postpartum. The data is not readily or easily comparable, so we can't actually know how many women are traumatised following birth because we haven't been measuring the same things for the same length of time using the same tools. I note now that tool has been validated in a number of countries based on the birth in trauma scale led by Susan Ayres. They write themselves in 2018 that the lack of quality research on PTSD may be because, and I quote, one of the possible barriers to this is the lack of validated questionnaires that measures postpartum PTSD. That's 2018, Ayres, Wright and Thornton. And you might note that I was writing up in 2018, so I didn't have access to that tool. So that explains where the state of the literature was at when I was writing about it. And this is what I also came across, a very helpful piece by Lely, Murtagh, McPhail and Thompson. And it started talking about how expectation and hope and experience, when they didn't align, that caused problems. So that helped me. And another pivotal piece was the idea of women getting post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of childbirth. So I have basically taken some of those ideas, brought them together, and then wondered if perhaps it was because of how birth went, that even if the outcome was good, it wasn't just so much the outcome, it was the fact that women had a bad experience in birth. So I would like to state here that I'm aware that obstetrics has had a gruesome history of experimentation on women's bodies, and I know that women were killed by doctors who refused to believe that they were the carriers of sepsis, known as childbed fever. Women have been objectified, dehumanised and ignored by obstetrics for many years and considered as mere vessels of the next generation. They have also, however, been delivered of children that would have otherwise killed them, and modern obstetrics appears to be more enlightened regarding the agency of women as birthing agents. Surgical births have become more common, and as such, women are advised that it is best to avoid these because they are not good for the baby over the longer term. Interestingly, evidence is contested. Caesarean rates have varied over the years, but at present in Australia, we have a caesarean rate of between 30-35%, with some of those at maternal request, and at that maternal mortality rate of between 5 and 6 in 100,000 that I referred to earlier. The morbidity rate, however, is quite different and more complicated, as I think you'll now understand. So this article was very helpful for me in trying to bring together some of those ideas. So some counterpoints that are often raised as a reason to explain away women's distress, and they are that birth in Australia is medicalised, and so I note that it can be. However, I would note in this particular study, I selected in women that were seeking a vaginal delivery with low intervention, no drugs or very few drugs. It was in a primarily midwife-staffed ward where obstetricians and anaesthetists were called in, but they were on site. Women were regarded as low risk. They were mostly under 33 years of age. They were all singleton pregnancies, and they were all actually supported by their partner or someone similar. But I think they all had their partner there, so they were supported as well. So I go back to my point, my assertion, my thesis, if you like, that I think birth hurts. And I think how we talk about it makes new hurts for women. So birth dissonance is therefore a term that I developed to understand the sense of mismatch and shock that women articulated about what they expected and what they experienced. It presented as trauma-like symptoms with ongoing fearfulness at 6 months post-delivery, intrusive memories, the development of chocophobia, which is not wanting to have further children. I was left to reflect on how we got here. And I guess I had to land on that there is a different set of interests at play in the delivery suite. Sorry, I've just done that. Sorry about that. And this is hard for women to navigate. Cohesive, multidisciplinary teams will help overcome this. There used to be, but there is no longer evidence that giving women an epidural leads to an assisted delivery. Sorry, I've just lost my little arrow again. Here he comes. And it's not as straightforward as it seems, because when studies post-2005 are looked at, the only difference is a longer first and second stage by half an hour. All other markers are the same. This leaves me to ponder the natural and the idea of it being used as a counterpoint, a foil to the medicalised, technological imbued birth associated with obstetrics. And all of this has helped me make sense of my experience, which I will share with you now. So some autoethnography. I didn't inflict you with a picture of myself. So this is in part the foundation of my study. I wish to contemplate morbidity in the form of post-birth trauma, which one of its forms is PTSD or post-traumatic stress or post-birth trauma, using personal experience. As I noted earlier, dissonance became an important idea to me as I started to grapple with the mismatch alluded to by Lally and colleagues, and my own experience of birth, where I thought I would be okay, given my education as a nurse, my work in hospitals, my generally no-nonsense attitude to things and ability to speak up for myself. In 2000, 2001, I was having a low-risk pregnancy and singleton baby and normal presentation. I went into spontaneous labour at 40 weeks and 2 days. At 1 a.m. in the morning, it was early, not very serious, but annoying, keeping me awake labour. I watched the 50th rerun of Ground Force with Alan Titchmarsh for company on TV. I was a textbook, low-risk, normal pregnancy and presumably a delivery. Well, I was, but I wasn't, because I had absorbed these messages about birth and how women should birth. I presented to the hospital at 7:30 a.m, telling them I was uncomfortable. They didn't sound thrilled to see me, but my contraction pattern was good, so I was admitted. Off I went. I tried to birth without pain relief. That lasted 2 hours. Then gas, another 4 hours. It was too much. But no one asked me how I was feeling. I asked for something else. There was no anaesthetist. She was too far away. I was given pethidine. The pain was unbearable. I was going to die of it. I was given more pethidine. I was 7 centimetres dilated. I was offered a bath, but no gas in the bath. This was a disaster. I had another several hours of this to go, according to them, and I wanted to die. I could not talk. No one asked me about my pain. My husband spoke for me. He told them I needed an epidural. I heard him ask and thought he was a genius. How did he know this? He was so right. But I knew I could not sit on the bed for it. I even laboured upright, as in standing. More gold stars. Thinking about what a shame it was, I would not see my child grow up and my husband was going to have to rear them alone. Some time later, an hour or so, I delivered a baby who was 8 pounds, a compound presentation, so that means an arm over the shoulder, meaning I had to push more than just a head out, just about standing up. No epidural, a grade 3 tear, you can DM me for more details, I won't share them here, use your imagination, and a episiotomy and a cut and stitches to match the grade 3 tear that took 1.5 hours to embroider up. I had many things in my favour, but even so, I had a sense that I did not know what the hell had just happened, but something major had. I didn't get it. I had done it all the right way. Everyone in the birthing suite was just about high-fiving, saying how well I'd done. What on earth were they talking about? The square and diamond patterned fabric from the curtains was emblazoned on my brain as I had focused on them to ride it out. On the outside, it looked great. A vaginal birth, no epidural, a decent tear, a healthy baby, mum up and about, no forceps, no vacuum, no IV even. That night, I bit into a towel and cried at 3 different intervals over 7 hours. I didn't want to wake the woman in the next door while I was meant to be sleeping because I wished I had died. I didn't want to live, and I had just had a healthy daughter. All I could think was, my God, as a woman, if she has children, she has to go through that. And this birth, my birth experience, would count in the statistics as a good birth. With this personal history, and then having done this work, because I felt like I had misunderstood something, I realised that perhaps I hadn't got it so wrong. Perhaps I had been failed by what went before me and by the competing models of birth in the delivery suite, and they had both forgotten about the birthing woman. Perhaps the actual facts around birth were not being shared because they were kind of ugly and didn't match what some healthcare professionals think birth should look like. So in conclusion, birth dissonance appears to arise when expectations are not met by reality. And very importantly, not having pain relieved in labour appears to me to be particularly traumatising. I think some simple fixes to this are available to us. It seems glaringly obvious. Focus on what women want in labour, and if they change their mind, that's okay. Give them data on what is the likelihood of them labouring the way they have described that they want to. And when they ask for pain relief, obviously assess them, but believe them, privilege their experience. And so the takeaway messages I hope you would take from this presentation, apart from my appalling IT use of my little pointer thing, is it's all about birthing women. No ideology of any group should prevail or be privileged. And it's an iterative process, and it needs revisiting as labour progresses, privilege the voices and the wants of women. And this will likely enable women to exit the birth process less traumatised. It may lead to better outcomes for mothers and babies and their families. I don't know this, and I need to do a larger follow-up study to determine the prevalence of birth dissonance and if there is a reliable remedy. Thank you.